Hey kids, how you doing? So what I've got for you today is one of my more in-depth tactics videos where I take a look at some real decisions that you're going to be facing in the midst of a game and just kind of go deep on those kind of decisions. Now this is the kind of video that takes a little bit of extra work compared to videos where, for example, I'm just ranking mechs or something like that. So I know that some of you are big fans of these tactics videos, but they don't get as many views as the ones where I'm just ranking mechs. So if you like these kind of videos, please give me a like on this one. I don't usually ask for likes, but likes would be much appreciated on this type of video because I love making them. They're really interesting to make. They take more time than my average video, and if you appreciate them, I really appreciate you showing me that you like them. Alright, so with all that blah 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 out of the way, the video is going to be about focusing fire, which of course is one of the most central tactical notions in BattleTech. Focusing fire, usually, as we say in my work, other things being equal, is the best thing to do. Anytime you have the opportunity to focus fire on one target instead of splitting your fire between multiple targets, if there's not a special reason why you should split your fire, your default should be to focus your fire. So here's just a really simple example, which is a pretty average kind of example that you'll run into a lot in your games. We've got a Griffin and a Warhammer on the red team deciding who to shoot at between the Marauder and the Crab on the green team. Now the Warhammer is only in a position to shoot the Marauder because there's a level 2 hill that blocks, the corner of the hill blocks the Warhammer's line of sight to the Crab. So the Warhammer, of course, is going to want to shoot the Marauder. And then what's the Griffin going to want to do? Of course, looking at this situation, everybody needs 9s to hit. So it's not harder for the Griffin to hit the Marauder versus hit the Crab. So the obvious thing for the Griffin to do is to focus his fire on the Marauder. And that way, the Griffin and the Warhammer have a better chance of doing all kinds of good things, like causing a pilot skill roll that might knock that Marauder down, or just, in general, doing more damage to the Marauder and coming closer to getting one of the targets out of the game. Now, right away, let me point out some of the ways that this rule is not an ironclad rule. So, for example, suppose that the Crab is pretty heavily damaged, so that the red player thinks, oh, there's an excellent chance that even with these 9s to hit, a single round of firing from the Griffin could potentially destroy the Crab or otherwise put it out of the game. Well, that's a situation where you certainly might want to split your fire. Have the Griffin shoot at the Crab, take the chance that you might take the Crab out, and then have the Warhammer fire at the Marauder. Another factor that should influence your decisions about when to split your fire is your target numbers. So take this example here. We've got a Griffin and a Warhammer thinking about firing at a Marauder and a Crab again. And this time, when the Griffin is firing at the Marauder, he's got to shoot through some woods, okay? And we're kind of at range, so these aren't going to be super easy shots. The Griffin will need 9s to hit the Crab, and the Warhammer will need 9s to hit the Marauder, but the Griffin would need 10s to hit the Marauder. And in this situation, like before, the Crab is out of line of sight of the Warhammer because it's blocked by those woods. Now, in this kind of a situation, you got to keep in mind that it's way easier to hit with 9s than it is to hit with 10s. Okay, you're talking about a 28% chance versus 17% chance. So almost double the chance to hit if you need 9s versus if you need 10s. So this is a kind of a situation that you'll face a lot early in the game when you are at long range. Your target numbers aren't that great, but you'll get maybe slightly better target numbers if you split your fire. And in this kind of early game situation, my preference is to split your fire if you're going to get better target numbers, because your odds of hitting in the first place if you're rolling 10s against that Marauder are not so great at all. Early in the game, or in other situations where your target numbers are pretty bad, pretty difficult to hit with, you just want to get damage on the board, okay? Because if you're rolling 10s or 9s, there's no guarantee that you're going to be hitting your target at all with anything. So you might as well go for the better target numbers in this kind of situation, and at least your odds of dealing some damage at all are going to be better. So that's usually my philosophy about this kind of a situation. So let's look at another matchup. In this case, red team has a hunchback and a warhammer, and green team has, again, a marauder and a crab. So this is a situation where, you know, supposing equal target numbers or equally difficult target numbers, the red team is definitely going to want to focus fire. And they could pick either the crab or the marauder, you know, depending on the variant of the marauder. If it was a kind of standard 30-25 marauder with that explosive autocannon ammo, you probably want to pick the marauder because its vulnerability compared with its hitting power is pretty high actually. But anyway, you definitely want to focus your fire in this kind of a standard situation. But let's complicate the situation. So now suppose that the red player has managed to put the hunchback behind the marauder and the warhammer is still in front of the two enemy mechs. Well, suppose then that the hunchback, of course, is obviously going to want to shoot into the rear arc of the marauder. Now, should the warhammer join with the hunchback and focus fire on the marauder? I would say in a lot of situations, depending on, you know, suppose that these are clean mechs, the marauder and the crab have not received any damage yet. I would say this is another situation where you actually want to split your fire. And the reason is, first of all, there's a good likelihood that you're not going to need to concentrate your fire in order to cause a piloting skill roll on the marauder, because if that hunchback's autocannon 20 hits at all, then the marauder is going to be making a piloting skill check no matter what. Additionally, if you're firing an AC-20 into the rear of a marauder, at least if it's kind of one of the ordinary variants of the marauder that's carrying some ammunition on board, there's a pretty decent chance that that marauder is going to die in one turn of that fire actually, if you have good target numbers anyway, because an autocannon 20 to the rear torso is not something that a marauder can always withstand. So if you double up your fire on the marauder, there's a good chance that the fire coming from the warhammer is going to actually be redundant and is going to, in effect, go to waste, because the fire from the hunchback would have been enough to just kill the marauder, especially as you can see in this kind of situation where the hunchback is on a level 1 hill behind the marauder, so it's also going to get a rear upper level kick on the marauder, which might be a kick that hits the rear torso, or it might hit the head with that kick. So in this kind of a situation, that marauder might well be out of the game from just the hunchback's fire. And if the hunchback's fire doesn't put the marauder out of the game, which probably it won't, there's a good chance it will, but it probably won't. Even then, if you're doing both rear damage and front damage, especially if the front damage goes to the front torsos, that damage is also kind of redundant, right? Because if you destroy the rear torso armor on one of the locations and you can keep firing at that rear torso in later turns, then that's kind of a separate way of making progress towards destroying the marauder as opposed to doing damage to the front torsos. So if the marauder survives for more than one turn after this, even then there's a good chance that damage done by the warhammer to the front of the marauder won't be crucial in destroying the marauder, because there's a good chance that the hunchback might be able to stay in the rear arc of the marauder and kill it from the rear through the rear torsos in a later turn. All that is to say that one of the situations where I often think it's good to split your fire is if you have the opportunity to fire at the rear of one enemy unit and to the front of another different enemy unit. Firing at the rear of the one enemy unit is not going to stack as much with firing into the front of that same unit. Here's another situation where splitting fire I think is a good idea. Here's a situation where it's going to be quite difficult for both of your mechs to bring their full damage potential to bear on a single one of the two enemy mechs. So the Griffin has considerably worse target numbers firing against the crab compared with the marauder. So it seems like the Griffin is in a position where he really ought to fire at the marauder. Now the warhammer could torso twist and fire one of his arm-mounted PPCs at the Marauder, but that wouldn't put him in a position to fire the rest of his front-firing weaponry at the Marauder, whereas the Crab is in his front arc, so he's going to be able to unload with his full front-facing arsenal against the Crab. So in this kind of example, if the Griffin and the Warhammer decide to focus their fire on the same target, whichever target they choose, either the Griffin or the Warhammer is going to be giving up on a lot of its likely damage potential with that attack. So this is a situation where you really ought to split your fire because your damage potential overall just becomes so much higher by splitting your fire. On the other hand, if the difference in the Griffin's target numbers is not so bad, like imagine that the Griffin only needs 8s instead of 9s to hit the Crab, well then the difference in probability for the Griffin's hits between the Crab and the Marauder is not such a large difference. And I think that's a kind of situation where even though the Griffin is somewhat reducing its damage potential by focusing together with the Warhammer on the Crab, I think in that kind of situation it's worth it, because the focused fire advantage is enough to make it worth it. Now when we bring in factors about how damaged the enemy mechs are, things become much more complicated, and decisions about where to focus your fire become more complicated in turn. So take this kind of example. I'll describe it real quick because it's a little complicated. The Crab is undamaged on the green team, and also on the green team is a Marauder that's quite damaged, and in particular, its right torso armor is breached and it has received 2 engine hits. Okay, and this is a mech, we'll say, that has an extra light engine. The red team has a Hunchback that needs 7s to hit either the Marauder or the Crab. So pretty good numbers. But also they have, you can see up in the left, a Commando, which has excellent numbers, 5s, or an 83% chance with every weapon to hit the Marauder. And the Commando, as you can see, is in the right side arc of the Marauder. So its hits are going to have an extra high chance of hitting that extremely damaged right torso location on the Marauder. And something we all know about the Commando is that it fires with a whole lot of short-range missiles. So there's going to be quite a few SRMs, each of which has the potential to crit out that damaged engine on board the Marauder. So in this kind of a situation, I think it depends a little bit on where you're at in the game, but in a lot of situations, I think what you're going to want to do is take a bit of a gamble and fire with the Commando at the damaged Marauder, then fire with the Hunchback at the undamaged Crab. With its autocannon 20, the Hunchback has a decent chance actually of pretty much killing the Crab with a hit. Okay, that's not likely to happen, but it's a possibility. Meanwhile, the Commando has an excellent chance of killing the Marauder with a single round of fire. So as a result, it's not the most likely outcome, but a decently likely outcome is that this kind of a Hail Mary attack where you split your fire between the 2 targets could potentially mission kill both the enemy mechs, or at least there's a good chance that the Hunchback's fire is not going to be necessary in order to kill the Marauder. But it depends. If you're in a situation where you're a little bit ahead in the game and it would cement your lead if the Marauder were destroyed, in that kind of a situation you don't super care so much about whether you do much damage to the Crab. So in that kind of situation where maybe you're up 1 mech or something like that, I would say that's a situation where you want to focus your fire on the Marauder, even so. Whereas if you are behind, and the best chance you have of getting back in the game is to destroy both of these mechs, then I would say split your fire for sure. So this gets back to a video of mine from back in the day, which you can check, on my channel, about how to play when you're behind. Because the way you should play the game and the level of risk that you should be comfortable with, the level of kind of randomness that you should be willing to allow the dice gods to introduce into the game, that should depend on how good of a chance you think you have of winning. If you're ahead, you should play more cautiously in this kind of a situation compared to if you're behind, actually. So as I'm sure you can tell, there's a ton of ins, outs, and gray areas to these kinds of examples about focusing fire. There's a bunch more examples that I could come up with and show you to kind of illustrate similar principles, but we don't have all day. Those are the ones I've got for you today. So let me know your thoughts about this. I wonder if you might agree or disagree with me about some of these examples. Anyway, I hope that these kind of considerations will be useful to you in your thinking about when do you split fire versus when do you concentrate your fire.